All right, folks, we're going to get started here. But if you're still joining us, please do go ahead, introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us who you are, where you're joining us from, what your role is in your school, your district, what you're interested in hearing about today, any and all of that. We love to see all of that as we're getting started here. But without further delay, let's get into today's session. It is From Research to Reading Joy, applying the science of reading to engage and inspire learners. It's a special session here for National Reading Month in March. Today's presenters, I'm going to let them introduce themselves a little bit, but we have Dr. Erin Bailey, VP of Literacy Programs and Research from Reading is Fundamental, and our own Dr. Amy Dray here from Edmentum, our Director of Efficacy Research. So Erin and Amy will be sharing a lot with you here today. I'm actually going to take down the slide presentation so you can see them better, and then I'm going to ask them to tell you a little bit about themselves and their work. Let's start with you, Erin. Can you tell our participants here about the work you do at Riff?
Thanks, Ross. It's great to be here. Before joining RIF, I was a classroom teacher and a reading specialist. I joined Reading is Fundamental, or RIF, a little over 4 years ago. And as my title indicates, what I do is kind of what I describe as the bookends of our program. So I design the programs based on research best practices. Our wonderful programs teams works with schools across the country. We are a national nonprofit to implement those programs. And then I oversee our efficacy and research and evaluation efforts to inform our programs. And then that creates a loop. It's a feedback loop. Research, which I know we'll get into, is never finished. So we use what our findings to inform our further program design.
Excellent. Amy?
Thanks. I'm Amy. I am the Director of Efficacy Research here at Edmentum. At Edmentum, I work across disciplines, but before my time, I spent many, many years first as a teacher and then as a reading researcher for about 20 years now. So I've been working in reading for a long time.
Excellent. Um, I'd love to start with just a little bit about the foundational research out there on the science of reading. Actually, just this week, I was at the CCSSO legislative conference with state chiefs from all over the country and a lot of their teams. And the science of reading, once again, was one of the topics of conversation there. And so we had leaders from a variety of states talking about how they really do emphasize science of reading in their legislation, right? In what they prioritize as far as approved materials for curriculum and what they want schools to be doing. And even though I think a lot of us have probably heard quite a bit about this in recent years, it still is something that's a major emphasis. So I would love to start with each of you maybe sharing one, core finding from literacy research, one thing that is kind of really meaningful that our school leaders out there, or maybe district leaders, but our decision makers who are making those determinations on what types of materials should they be using, whether they want to see in their schools, something they should be prioritizing when they're selecting instructional materials or shaping their practices. Is there something kind of in the research that is worth, I think, revisiting and going back to, right, and saying, okay, let me make sure I'm paying attention to this as I'm evaluating our practices, our materials, what we want to do. I'll start with you on this one, Amy, and then Erin.
Sure. I mean, I think one thing that it's really important to remember as we're talking about what's now called the science of reading is that it's been around a long time, for about 20 years. The National Reading Panel first came out with some of these pillars of science of reading: phonics, fluency, phonological awareness, vocabulary. And I think one thing that it's really important to keep in mind is it's an aid of students learning to make meaning of lots of different types of texts and being able to understand what they read. So we're all in aid of reading comprehension, and you don't want to lose sight of comprehension as you're grappling through all of these different aspects of what's called the science of reading. Erin, what do you think?
I would echo what you said, and I love that you brought it back to the National Reading Panel, which came out in the year 2000, so over 20 years ago, but that really looked at research that had been conducted from 1966 all the way to 1999 when the National Reading Panel was commissioned. And as I mentioned earlier, research is an iterative process. It's never complete. So I think what's important for administrators to remember is that research builds upon. I love also that you mentioned that it's now called the science of reading. Someone asked me, what was it called before that? Because this has been around for, over 20 years. And I said, I think it was just called reading instruction. When I went to grad school, we just called that reading instruction. But, now it's commonly known as the science of reading. And I think the two things that I would want administrators to look at when they're selecting their materials is ensuring that the curricular materials that you are selecting include explicit and systematic instruction. Those are really the two findings across all the pillars, Amy, that you mentioned that has to occur. So explicit, meaning it's structured, it's a direct approach, it uses a gradual release model. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with gradual release model, it starts with I do, the teacher modeling. We do, so teachers still modeling, but with some student input. And then I like to break the you do into kind of two parts. So you do a student and a partner or maybe a small group working together, and then you do on your own. So you can see there's lots of scaffolding there for students to have opportunities to practice before they're kind of just sent off on their own to apply a new skill. So that's the explicit part. And then the systematic part. Systematic is a fancy word, but you can just think of it as simple to complex, the way that you were describing, Amy. We're going to start with the most simple skills of reading and then continue to build on those. And for administrators who are looking for a resource to help evaluate the curriculum, I do have a recommendation. The Reading League recently put out a rubric. I had an opportunity to take a look at the rubric. I think it's very thorough. They've organized it by those pillars that Amy mentioned, and they have at the top of the rubric some red flags. These are things that you can look for in a curriculum that you can automatically check off if the curriculum does not align with science of reading. And then my recommendation there is depending on where you are in your curriculum adoption cycle, sometimes you might find some red flags and you're not able to replace the curriculum, but it's a great way to inform your teachers about why certain aspects are not aligned to science of reading and integrate stronger teaching and strategies until you are able to adopt a new curriculum.
Yeah. Are there things, Erin, along those lines that in those discussions with teachers, right? Maybe an administrator is either having some discussion about what is or is not in the curriculum, or what are some things to be aware of that I guess make those conversations feel accessible to teachers, like on a practical level, right? Here's kind of what you need to know right now, because what you need to do is use this for instruction. And so there's a lot of stuff to know, right? But some of it is a little bit much for right now. But how do we focus on that, or how do we just make that a kind of an accessible conversation, so that teachers can really take it and apply it, right, and put it into action and focus on the few main things? Do you have any thoughts
Mhm.
on that?
And this was something when I was a reading specialist at a school when we evaluated our curriculum. This was something we did. We sat down with teachers and we're like, we can't go through everybody's individual unit plans and flag everything for you, but here are some things that we're going to flag for you, and then we want you to go through your curriculum and flag it for yourself. So the two things that I mentioned, if there's not explicit instruction happening, if you're learning, for example, phonics, this is a hot topic, through inquiry, that's a big no-no. You want your phonics to be taught explicitly, and you want it to follow that simple to complex. So we're starting with learning the single letter sounds, short vowel sounds, and so on and so forth. Different curriculums might teach things in a different order. So, for example, we have what's commonly called magic E or silent E, that E at the end of the word that makes a vowel long. That may or may not be taught before, vowel combos like AI, EE. Those are kind of simple things, but the overall picture is if you're just teaching things, what I like to call ad hoc, as you encounter them in a book. So just giving kids books and saying like, you came to this word and here's the phonics pattern. That's not what we want to do. We want to make sure that we're explicitly teaching it, that it's starting from simple to complex.
Excellent. Would love to talk about some of the misconceptions you might see or hear from people about science of reading, from educators, even, I'm sure from administrators, right? As you're in conversation or you're thinking about what folks, really understand or some things that they might have a misunderstanding of. Um, I'll start with Amy on this, but are there any common misconceptions that you see out there about the science of reading, and how can leaders maybe be aware of those, right? And then address them so that they're able to build buy-in and a common understanding about, a better understanding of what those things are, where there may be some misconceptions.
I would say that one thing I've observed, and I'm curious if Erin has observed it too, is that there's a strong focus on phonics, and sometimes other pieces of the package of the science of reading are left behind. And one thing that gets left behind is the importance of vocabulary. So the size of a child's vocabulary, what they come to school with, varies enormously. Children can have 1,000 words under their belt when they show up at kindergarten. They can have 5,000 words when they show up at kindergarten. And vocabulary is actually one of the strongest predictors of reading comprehension. So children can learn the rules of phonics and decoding. They can sound out a word, but if they've never run into the word before in their life, they don't have a mental image or an idea of what that word means when they sound it out. And you see this in particular with students who speak more than one language, where they can learn the rule, they can learn the appropriate way to say the word garden, for example. But if they've never seen a garden, if they live in the city, if they don't know what that word is, and they don't know it in English and they've maybe never seen it before, they are not going to necessarily understand. And I think that it's sometimes back to Erin's point about explicit teaching. When you're teaching these words and when you're working with kids in the classroom, it's very important to be explicit about vocabulary as well. So be explicit in defining the words, be explicit in helping them understand what the words mean, and pay attention to the types of words and use a lot of words. Allow, you scaffold them, you use big words, and then go along and explain it to them as you're using these big words because they're going to get their exposure to words from you.
I could not agree more, Amy, and I am a vocabulary nerd, so I deeply appreciate that. And I learned about vocabulary and the research around vocabulary when I started off teaching. So I started off teaching fifth grade. The school that I was teaching in, 99% of students were native Spanish speakers. And as a fifth grade teacher, I found myself perplexed at why, when I listened to students reading, they could read all the words on the page, i.e., phonics, but they weren't understanding what they read. And that's when I discovered vocabulary instruction and the need for explicit vocabulary instruction. When I discovered that, it was like the key that unlocked my students' comprehension, and they started to have reading gains throughout the rest of the year. So, just focusing on phonics isn't going to solve all of our reading issues. Um, the other thing that I would emphasize, as I mentioned before, is that research builds over time. So if you think back to the National Reading Panel, and their meta-analysis of research that had been done from the 1960s to 1999, there wasn't a big emphasis of multilingual learners and multilingual learning processes at that time. And since then, there's been a lot of research in that area. So it's important to continue to explore research. The example that I use, although it's probably not a popular one, is, in the medical community, there has been changes from decade to decade on what they recommend for dietary. So, at one point it was you need a high protein diet, and then, you need more leafy green vegetables. And people tend to not question that. They just say, oh, okay, based on the research that we have available at the time, this is the current recommendation. And with reading, it's the same way. We have recommendations at the time. We continue to do research. It's an iterative process. We take research and it's not a one and done. You can replicate the same study with a different population of students, maybe urban, rural, suburban communities, different grade levels, different student backgrounds. And you want to replicate those studies over time so you can see what is the most effective for all students.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Erin, getting into the title, research to reading joy, right? That joy element. So that's another piece. Right? If we're just focusing on different slivers of the science of reading approach, right? We may not look at the holistic, okay, what does it mean to sustain engagement in reading and have students be um, self-motivated, right? And continue to want to come back to it and building on their own reading. So part of that is what creates that enjoyment. And so I know a lot of this relates to your work, and you've been hosting a podcast called Reading Inspires, so that gets to it as well. But sort of drawing from your work, are there, classroom or school-wide strategies that you've seen that successfully pair like the research-based instruction with authentic texts and student choice to boost their joy in the reading? Um, and I know, I mean, we have some questions here. I think this will start to get to some of what our participants are interested in, right? But that I'm sure there's strategies in here that apply across grade levels, right? And certainly highly relevant for those secondary learners that are able to have that choice in selecting and really thinking about how do we make sure that we are teaching reading explicitly and according to the right strategies, but also understanding that we need to account for the various things our students are interested in and texts that are authentic to their experience, as you were both just talking about, right? They can build their reading score so much more if they understand the subject matter and it really relates to them, all of those kind of things. But yeah, tell us a bit about that.
Yes. So, what we are particularly interested in our research efforts at Reading is Fundamental is on reading motivation, which is largely not covered by, science of reading, despite the fact that there are many studies around reading motivation. And it goes hand in hand with what you're explaining, Ross, around text choice and text relevance. So, in our work, we focus on self-determination theory, which is kind of a framework for building intrinsic motivation, which is different than reading because you're going to win a pizza, which was, a popular program in the 90s and early 2000s. But intrinsic motivation is when you read because you believe in your abilities to read and you want to do so. You enjoy it. That's the joy part. And so we frame motivation around autonomy, or that's a fancy word, for choice, competence, your feelings of your beliefs in yourself and your attitudes about your reading, and relatedness. How can you relate to the text? Why would you choose to read that text? So in our programs, and I'll use our middle school program as an example, that's for grades 6 through 8. Students are given choice to text. In our programs, we organize the books by genre and topic, and we actually went out and interviewed middle schoolers to ask them, what genres and topics are you interested in? And we named them accordingly so that they would be relevant. So typically a genre, you might say humor, but that's not really a word that middle schoolers use. So we called it funny. We also asked them, what other books do you want to read? And they said drama. But what they meant was like relationship drama, friendship drama, or, dating, as some middle schoolers are starting to explore that. So relationships is what we call that topic. And so in our model, during our book, what we call book celebration events, which you can think of as a rock concert for books, we get those kids all hyped up and then we send them to tables to choose 3 books to take home and own and read on their own. And that does relate to the research around text choice because the research shows that when students select the books that they are going to read, they are going to read them more frequently. They're going to be more engaged when they read, and they're going to have higher reading comprehension because it's a topic that is relevant to them. So that's, one of our current studies. What we use to measure that is what's called the adolescent motivation to read profile. The citation for that is Pitcher et al. 2007. And so that examines reading motivation broken up into two kind of constructs: self-efficacy, or your perceptions about your reading ability, and your value of reading. That's your beliefs in that reading's important. So, a question, for example, from that survey is, when I receive a book as a gift, I feel, and then it's like a Likert kind of scale. And what we found was that through this program, when we provide choice and access and relevant texts for middle schoolers, they increase in both their self-efficacy and their value of reading. And what
Hmm.
was interesting about this study is the sharpest gain in value of reading was in students' perceptions of reading as a social activity, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it because middle schoolers are very social, but it's great to have data to back up what we believe about middle schoolers and their reading journey.
Yeah. And I think like one thing that's thinking about as we're considering, what some of the data, the NAEP data, other data says about literacy, and reading skill development, and where there's improvement that can be achieved. Um, is It still often is said that elementary is learning to read, and then when kids get to middle school, it's reading to learn. But I think like, that can be oversimplified, right? Because middle schoolers and high schoolers are still learning to read, especially many of them if they're struggling. But even if they're not, there still is reading instruction that is happening and should be happening at those secondary levels, right? They hopefully are more advanced, and of course, then the reading that they're doing is also supporting their learning across subject areas, but it's not like reading instruction just stops.
No, and in fact, Ross, it can't stop. So I want to return to the idea of explicit instruction when it comes to adolescents. First of all, adolescents have to read across disciplines. So that's the big thing that happens with kids in high school and middle school is that they're reading in math textbooks, they're reading in science textbooks, they're reading in social studies textbooks, they're reading digital products, they're reading across multiple disciplines. So vocabulary, back to that idea, super important to scaffold students in their understanding of vocabulary words that are unfamiliar to them, but are familiar within a discipline. So there are words like product in mathematics.
Hmm.
The word product, that is not a term that they may associate with math. That needs to be taught to them explicitly so they can make the connections between what product might mean out in the world at a grocery store and what it means in math. Another place where students need explicit instruction for adolescents is making meaning of what's actually on the page of a text. I work in curriculum development, and sometimes the things that are on a text, you'll have these interesting pictures about a mountain climber. And really, the text page is about barometers. Well, what does a mountain climber have to do with a barometer? And if you say to the kid, what's this text about? They'll say mountain climbing. It has nothing to do with mountain climbing. It's about barometers and reading barometers and science. But so you have to help them make meaning of these things as they're encountering them across disciplines. Back to Erin's point about genres, they'll be reading op-ed pieces. Op-ed pieces are not necessarily facts. How do they make meaning of people's opinions in TikTok? How do they make meanings of different opinions in Instagram? Those are basically op-ed pieces for all intents and purposes. How do they make sense of that genre? How do they move between persuasive
Hmm.
genre and a factual textbook, and a story. So those are things genre awareness can be very explicitly taught as well. So I thank the people for calling us out on adolescent reading because sometimes you can get stuck thinking that the science of reading is only talking about elementary school, and that's not the case.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, it's so important. I've like observed this for myself that your brain is kind of activated and always on around making meaning, around like information literacy and how that relates to literacy, right? Because in the digital era on the internet and there's so much information flowing at all times that if you're not pretty much constantly thinking about evaluating it. Where's this coming from? What does it mean? What's the intent behind it, right? Is it an opinion? Is it a fact? Is it based on research, etc.? It all kind of just goes in to the mix, right? And if you're not thinking about it actively in the moment, what is this information I'm reading and what's it about? You're going to lose track of it even if it's unintentional because I just read five different things and I can't remember what came from where and who wrote what and this thing came from an author that I'm familiar with and I understand their background and their intent. This other thing I don't even know what the source was. It's it's so it's valuable for educators to be thinking about those things and understanding, oh, here's all the various ways that students encounter information that they're reading and the different places where they might access it and the questions that we want them to be asking and thinking about and especially as our students are getting older into those secondary years, we know that there's just so much information they're exposed to. And that's a critical part of those reading skills is knowing what am I reading, who wrote it, what was their yeah intent behind that, all of those things. Um, Amy, in from efficacy research you've done and that you're familiar with, I actually so we're going kind of back and forth between some topics here that are relevant to contextualizing this within kind of the school level, the organizational level, right, and decisions we're making, and then applying it in actual classrooms, knowing that these things need to work together. Um, but I know one of the things out there is that there can be a lot of terminology can be used a lot by curriculum developers, vendors, etc., right? And sometimes we have to ask questions about what does this actually mean? So if we're trying to figure out, for example, is this tool or this intervention or this curriculum material truly evidence based on the standards around the science of reading, and what does that really mean? Are there a couple of questions that an administrator should ask? Or truthfully, a teacher could ask the same thing, right? Because they're evaluating materials they're using in their class and really trying to get to what is the actual evidence for this, and how should that be defined? Because I do feel like terms like evidence-based, research-based, etc., it's I'm guessing that not every time that is said does it mean the same thing, right? But I'm sure educators and folks who are deciding on curricula and using them, or even have some flexibility in their classrooms around tools that they're using, want to feel like they have a good understanding of, what, okay, I feel confident to say that this truly is science of reading. There's evidence behind it, and I get that.
Sure. I mean, I think first of all, any curriculum should be able to point out regarding the science of reading where the curriculum's talking about phonological awareness, where it's talking about phonics, where it's talking about fluency. How does it support vocabulary? How does it support comprehension? So it's important that whatever curriculum or vendor you're looking at, that they're covering all of those. If they come in and they say, oh, gee, we have this great AI tool for phonics, well, that's only one piece of the puzzle. So you really need to look for a robust curriculum that's covering a lot of things. I also think the question to ask is the company actually actively investing in research? What studies show efficacy? Do they have recent studies that show efficacy? Are they actually developing a research base and spending money on it? It takes, Edmentum has to spend money on me and my team to actually do the work. It's not cheap. but it's super important to make sure that the work that's being done is of high quality. I would also ensure that the curriculum or product has met industry standards. So the exact path insights diagnostic was validated by the National Center of Intensive Intervention as an academic screening tool. Look for that. Exact path growth has met standards in What Works Clearinghouse and the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA. So you want to look for those things. Does it meet a tiered ESSA study qualifications? The instructional materials need to be evidence-based and they need to have some research behind it that supports the instructional model that they're promoting.
Yeah, it's and when you're doing real authentic research, you don't always know what questions come up as you start, right? So there's things that take time to investigate, but when you're working with real schools, real educators, you learn as you go and realize we should actually ask about this or investigate that, and it gives
Yeah,
you an
and you
authentic
and
representation of teaching and
you want
learning.
to do it with rigor. You want to do it with some
Mhm.
rigorous methodology that you can stand by. And yeah, I just think I've been in conversations with districts. People have asked me to meet with districts directly to explain the research findings, and that should be available to you, I believe.
Yeah. Excellent. Erin, let's talk reading engagement. So engagement, another word, right, that we hear a lot about, and we have to, number one, determine what does that really mean for students to be engaged and, um, and motivated and sustainably engaged in their learning and in their reading. Um, so I think, of course, initiatives around creating a culture of engagement can be can happen at the school level and there can be initiatives around that. And then, of course, the actual engagement happens at the classroom level. So we need these things to work in unison. But can you share some thoughts around creating that culture of reading engagement? We're in National Reading Month right now, so we're excited about it. But how do we extend that momentum throughout the year? Expanding access, family involvement, whatever are the different strategies that can play into generating and then sustaining that engagement. What would that look like for our participants to kind of lead some of those efforts?
Sure. So I think that engagement, it's difficult to measure, but it's something you should hopefully see, in the joy of the students that you're working with when they pick up a book and they're reading it. It's something you should be able to feel. So, I mentioned earlier we use the adolescent motivation to read profile. That's a tool, a survey tool, quantitative tool that you can use to read motivation. Engagement is a little bit different, and this is something that's not spoken a lot about in the science of reading, because science of reading is mostly around rigorous quantitative research, something that you can measure with a number. But there does exist a body of qualitative research as well, which is measuring students' experiences and measuring teachers' experiences. I don't even think the word measuring is right there, but kind of capturing students and teachers' experiences. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, that type of research doesn't belong in education, then you're probably in the wrong place, because, of course, we want to include teacher and student experiences in what works for reading instruction. So that's just kind of a plug that I'll give around how we measure engagement. It's almost more of a feeling, but you can see it when a student just lights up when they find a book that is just for them, something that they're excited about reading or something that they want to read with a friend or a group of friends. I mentioned earlier in our middle school work, reading as a social activity. When students find a book, and or think about the last book you read, was it recommended to you by a friend? Reading, despite the fact that we think it just happens between yourself as the reader, the text, and maybe the author, is actually a very social endeavor, because a lot of the reading that we do connects us to people and the world around us. So my suggestion, outside of thinking of direct reading instruction, which you should be using grade level texts to do, I would suggest engagement is around choice and access and relevance. So when teachers or leaders or librarians are organizing their libraries, they should remove barriers for students. One of those barriers being text levels. This isn't a very popular topic. It might make people feel a little bit uncomfortable, but Dr. Tim Shanahan recently wrote a book called Leveled Reading, Leveled Lives. And about how when we trap students in a reading level, when we say to a first grader, you're a level J and your books are in the level J bin, that's very stifling to students and it impacts not only their reading ability, but their feelings around their self-efficacy around reading, their confidence in their reading. So, as uncomfortable as that may make you feel, because I know as a first grade teacher, I had leveled bins in my library as well. It's something that many teachers experience. Removing that will remove a significant barrier. Try, like a librarian, organizing your books around topics, genres, popular authors. This will, and then let children choose. Again, this is for their independent or leisure reading, which is outside of direct reading instruction. But having a balance of those two, the text that you're going to use to teach reading, and the text that students are going to use to read in their leisure time, which again should be around choice, access, and relevance, is really going to increase engagement.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, I mean, forgive me because I'm going to try to tie some things together, and you might say this is, this isn't as rigorous as the research, but I do think to the point of trying to get those indications of where engagement is happening or where we can make it happen, and what does the approach, the research behind the approach tell us. That in, for example, some of the efficacy studies, and if we're thinking about what are some, metrics or data signals that might tell us that not only is a program working, but is it sustainable? Like, can this continue to work? This isn't just a small sample, or it happened in this one instance, and yes, that's true and backed by the evidence that we have, but is it applicable again and again? Right, that there's some pieces in there that I think relate to what Erin was just saying. One of the things that I think is always so important, to elevate in a lot of the efficacy research we have, for example, Amy, is the consistent evidence of growth across student groups, right, as defined by demographics or students receiving special education services, or student, different gender, race, ethnicity, all the is to say that it's consistent, so that it's not just okay, it's happening for one student group or in one instance, that there is this continual high level of growth and achievement happening, which I think those things would relate. So in practical matters, what is a teacher doing? One of those things would be accounting for what are strategies I can be using, whether it's by introducing flexibility or more choice, autonomy, etc. But so that all of my students are able to feel like they're engaging with their reading and literacy in a way that's authentic to them. And then also, are we using tools and materials that actually work for all students and that help us drive results? But I'll let you speak more to that. But, are there different things that kind of are good indicators that, okay, yes, this is working well, and yes, there's some good, evidence here that it can continue to work, or, that it will work in different environments, not just the one that we, happen to study in this instance.
Sure. I mean, first of all, to Erin's point, leveling kids, absolutely kids need to be exposed to tons of different materials across tons of different topics. Students are going to be interested in things, or kids or anybody is going to be interested in things other than or different from what their friend is interested in. So if a student wants to read about butterflies, great. If they want to read about sports, great. Like all reading is outstanding for me. When I look at how you think about measuring engagement, oftentimes we're a little stuck on time as a measure. We're sort of stuck on how long are they doing, how much time are they spending on something. And I like to think about engagement in different ways. For example, I'm always curious about what did they do in the in my case, I work in a digital product. So how far along do they get in the program? How far along do they get in the book? What are they doing and thinking about as they're participating in the program? A lot of these things I can't get at, but to Erin's point, I would love to get at some of the more qualitative data that elucidates how kids are when they are motivated. But for me, I like to think about what they've accomplished when they're using a particular curriculum or what skills have they mastered, how far are they going along, and less of a focus on how long it took them to do the work. And to Ross's point, like I think you want to make sure that the efficacy studies that you're looking at have been done with lots of different kids in different contexts because there's a lot of variation in the world.
Yeah. When we talk about that, that explicit systematic instruction, right, with the science of reading, um, I mean, of course, we've discussed how there's different things to account for, right? And with the motivation and choice components being important to also account for, should should I guess teachers feel like those things are in opposition to one another, right? And that it's an area where we have to we have to be um navigating competing objectives, or does that explicit instruction in fact support the motivation and choice and make it even more possible to bring that out? Erin and Amy, you can chime in as well.
So for this, I typically think of, I'm sure everyone's heard of the 80/20 rule or theory where, 80% of your success is usually attributed to 20% of your effort. And so that's where I'll take you through my flow of consciousness here. So when students feel supported in reading through explicit and systematic instruction, it will increase their self-efficacy or their beliefs in their ability to read. This will then increase their intrinsic motivation. So here comes in reading is fundamentals research around intrinsic motivation. When you are motivated to read, you will read more frequently. And to Amy's point, this doesn't have to always be measured by duration of reading. But when you're interested in reading, when you're motivated to read, you're going to read more. You're going to read more often. You are going to be able to sustain reading for longer periods of time. And what the research shows is that when you read more, you become a better reader. So you can see how I got through that kind of flow of, systematic, explicit instruction to joy and motivation. But it does go back to reading achievement. When you are enjoying reading, you will read better.
Yeah.
I also think it's important to be pretty specific about what we mean by explicit instruction because it can you can sort of say, well, what are we even talking about there? When I think about being explicit, I think about being organized, intentional, focused on individuals, people's needs. It shouldn't be scripted and it doesn't have to be stifling or unmotivating. What it means is that students understand what's expected of them in the lesson. The lesson's broken down into chunks that they can digest and do. The students get good feedback. They understand that their participation and responses in the class matters. They get a lot of chances to practice what they're learning, and teachers are responsive to what the students are doing, and the students feel heard. All of that leads to students being motivated and engaged. It is being explicit and being organized and being helpful and helping them understand that makes students feel heard, that makes them feel participatory, that makes them feel like they're part of a group, and that helps them be motivated and engaged in the lesson that they're learning.
Yeah. How about promoting, reinforcing literacy skills, promoting reading engagement, like at home? How can families be involved in that? How can schools and educators encourage, provide guidance, right? Provide a system for having families involved in reinforcing and strengthening literacy skills and turning reading into something that's not just what we do in class, but is part of what students do. I'll let you take that in whichever order, but would love some thoughts on that.
I think for what we try to do at Reading is Fundamental is create a culture, what we call a culture of reading in the home. And really that is built around joy and creating joyful experiences around reading. Amy mentioned earlier that children enter kindergarten with varying levels of vocabulary knowledge, and this is a predictor of their reading outcomes. Well, research shows that reading just one picture book to your child every day can increase their exposure to vocabulary by about 78,000 words a year, which is really incredible if you think about it. So, what we try to do is provide books, access, and choice for families so that they can build that culture and joy of reading in their homes.
I'm going to add a few things. I mean, I think back to my vocabulary thing. I like it when parents talk to their kids a lot, have a lot of conversations with them, build up their vocabulary. If you go to a baseball game, after the baseball game, talk about the baseball game. Take off your headphones when, put down your phone. Sometimes as adults, we tend to sort of get stuck in our laptops and our phones and our working materials. And kids aren't seeing us read. They don't know that I'm looking up a recipe when I'm looking at my phone. So get out the cookbook and
Yeah.
show them, like, hey, I'm actually reading when I'm doing something. They want to do, all kids are going to do what you do, what you model. So it's really important that you show them when you're reading and you're explicit about when you're reading. And I also think providing access, as Erin pointed out, to all sorts of materials, not just stories, but books about stuff like plants or sports. Kids are interested in a lot of different things, and they may not always want to read fiction. So give them other options, magazines, comic books. Kids like to read about topics that interest them, and students aren't always interested in the same things. And have conversations about what you're reading. Talk about what you read, what you heard about today, what you read in the newspaper, what you learned about when you were reading something at work. Those are really important modeling behaviors for parents to show that they're using their literacy skills every day in their jobs and in their lives, and that's an important thing for kids to know.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great point about when you're reading, you could be reading the New York Times on your phone or texting, and it looks the
They don't
same
know.
to
They have no
somebody else,
idea.
right? And so demonstrating what that is, and and such important points about the vocabulary knowledge. I mean that's again that's true across the entire grade span, right? And certainly it really comes into play when we're talking about cross-curricular learning and a student who is in middle school, high school, whose vocabulary is more limited and is struggling in history class or science, right? And that introducing just more continuous routine low stakes reading, like reading outside of school without the pressure that this is not homework, is important for strengthening vocabulary and just feeling like, okay, I am developing this. I'm getting a better understanding. Now I'm more equipped when I am in class. But that if it's always focused on, okay, this reading is always about the intention of this subject, this lesson, and I'm struggling with it now, I'm just feeling, like I may not want to do
Yeah.
that very much,
If
right?
you have kids who are interested in sports memoirs, right?
Mm,
Like, I don't know. I'm not a sports person, but there's tons of stuff out there. You could read Sports Illustrated. You could read
yeah.
like anything like that. If you have kids that are interested, students that are interested in a whole host of stuff, reading, I think reading is the best return on investment we can make as adults in a society. So, I believe in investing in it.
Excellent. I'll give you each one final question here as we're getting close to our time here. And it's pretty open-ended. It's kind of, do you have one final thing you'd like to leave for our participants? Either one strategy, one quick win to try for, or one something interesting you've read recently, or a book you'd recommend to people, or something that our participants can take and try and say, okay, this is one thing I can do that's going to give me a little bit more knowledge about science of reading and reading instruction. One thing I can test out, one resource I can check out. It will go with you, Amy, then we'll give Erin the last word on this, and then I'll share some more resources, and then we'll let everybody go back to their day here.
I think one thing is that we've talked a lot about reading and students and parents, but we really haven't talked about what teachers need to be successful. And I think, teachers need constant support and they need constant professional development and reminders. And I think that a lot of times we forget that the stuff that I'm taking for granted that I know or that Erin knows, we've been at this for a long time as reading instructors and reading teachers and reading researchers. But for people who haven't been teaching for a long time, I think supporting them in their emerging knowledge of what it means to teach reading is really important for district leaders, and investing in your teachers matters. And that would be maybe something I would end on.
I would echo Amy. I say this all the time. A 1 hour webinar or panel is not enough time to really dive deep into the vast body of research now known as science of reading. But hopefully, what you take away is a spark of curiosity. And so, where I would probably recommend starting is just looking at that report done by the National Reading Panel 2000. It is a very lengthy report, but each chapter has an executive summary, and then go from there because each of those pillars that Amy mentioned, like phonemic awareness, fluency, vocabulary, then you can start to dive into each of those and read. And there's lots of ways to get this information. You don't have to go to straight research papers if that's not something you're interested in or if that's not something that feels accessible for you. Try a blog, a podcast. There's lots of ways to get information these days.
And be
Excellent.
critical about what you're reading too, right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It's a constant thing, but we're all reading a lot, right? One way or another. We're absorbing a lot of information, reading a lot, online, emails that we're getting for work, not for work, and valuable to keep sharpening those skills. These are some more resources you are going to get to your email after the session, so you get the recording of this conversation. You'll also get an article about strategies to sustain summer reading strategies for your students. We'll have another article on leading reading campaigns in your school and making reading your brand in your school and influencing students to really engage there. We also have our science of reading toolkit. We have some efficacy research on Exact Path and how it has supported growth for struggling readers. We also can grab that National Reading Panel report and get that out for you too. Make it really easy for you. So these resources will come right to your email, easy to find. Please do check them out. If you have any questions, anything you'd like to learn more about, you can reply directly to that email. It'll go right to a real person who can help you and get in touch. So that's an easy way to check that out and to just continue your learning here or getting support on the initiatives that you have in your school. So please check all of that out. I really want to thank our panel for today, Dr. Amy Dray, Dr. Erin Bailey. Thanks so much for being with us and sharing your knowledge.
Thank you.
Thank you.